There's a question that haunts the minds of those who've built empires from nothing. When everything you've given is stripped away, what remains? Not the mansions, not the luxury cars parked in circular driveways, not the companies bearing your name in golden letters. What remains is something far more fragile, something that can't be bought or negotiated in boardrooms. It's the truth about who stands beside you when the world believes you're fading into shadow. This is the story of a man who possessed everything the world measures as success, yet found himself staring at a family photograph late one evening, asking a question that would change everything. A question born not from paranoia, but from the quiet wisdom that comes with age. If tomorrow I became powerless, if sickness claimed my strength and time marked my final chapter, who among those I've sacrificed for would truly care? Not about the inheritance, not about the properties, but about the man behind the wealth. And so he devised a test, one that would reveal the hearts of everyone under his roof. What he discovered would break him before it could heal him. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The estate sat on the edge of the city like a monument to ambition realized. 3 generations of struggle had culminated in this. Imported marble floors, chandeliers that caught sunlight like captured stars, and rooms so vast they echoed with emptiness despite being filled with people. The patriarch who built this kingdom was a man named Richard Thornton, though everyone called him Chief. He'd started with nothing but calloused hands and a refusal to accept the limitations others placed on him. Now in his 70s, Chief watched the world from the windows of his study with eyes that had witnessed both the beauty and brutality of building something from dust. He had a wife who'd stood beside him through the lean years, or so he'd believed. For children who'd never known hunger, never felt the weight of uncertainty that had shaped their father's character. A company that employed hundreds, hotels that hosted dignitaries, properties scattered across the country like chess pieces on a board he'd mastered. Yet something gnawed at him during those quiet moments when the house settled into night. His children moved through these halls with the confidence of heirs, already mentally dividing what hadn't been offered yet. His wife attended social functions, where she smiled for cameras, but rarely smiled at him anymore. And Chief found himself wondering, had he built a family, or had he merely funded spectators waiting for the final act? The decision came to him clearly one morning as he sat across from his family physician and longtime attorney. Both men had earned his trust through decades of discretion and counsel. Chief explained his plan with the measured tone of someone who'd already examined every angle. He would stage an illness, something terminal and convincing. Cancer, the doctor suggested, because it carried weight and offered a timeline. 6 months, perhaps less. Long enough to observe, short enough to feel urgent. His attorney, a silver-haired man named Thomas, understood immediately but urged caution. He proposed moving half of Chief's assets into a separate, undisclosed account, a safety net, he called it, though both men knew it was armor against betrayal. Chief agreed, and within 72 hours, the machinery of deception began turning. Medical reports were prepared, private accounts were established, and the wealthy industrialist who'd commanded boardrooms and negotiated million-dollar contracts prepared to play the most difficult role of his life, a dying man. The transformation began subtly. Chief started missing breakfast, claiming fatigue. He'd pause halfway up the staircase, gripping the banister as though the climb had stolen his breath. His cough, carefully practiced, echoed through hallways late at night. His family noticed, their concern performing exactly as concern should in the opening acts of crisis. They gathered around him with worried faces when Dr. Harrison delivered the diagnosis, his voice heavy with practiced sorrow. Terminal cancer. Advanced stage. 6 months if fortune smiled, perhaps only 3. The house responded as houses do when death announces its approach. His wife, Victoria, pressed trembling fingers to her lips. His eldest son Marcus immediately began asking about treatment options, his voice urgent but his eyes already calculating. The middle son, James, looked genuinely stricken, though Chief noticed how quickly his gaze shifted to his siblings, measuring their reactions. His elder daughter, Patricia, excused herself, overcome with emotion that seemed genuine until Chief heard her on the phone an hour later, discussing property values with someone whose voice carried the clinical detachment of a real estate appraiser. Only his youngest, his daughter Sarah, reacted in a way that pierced the performance Chief was staging. She knelt beside his chair, took his weathered hands in her young ones, and simply wept. No questions about prognosis. No discussion of next steps. Just grief, pure and unfiltered, for a father she believed she was losing. That night, she moved a chair into his room and refused to leave. The first week passed in a choreography of care that felt almost authentic. They brought him meals on elegant trays. They lowered their voices in hallways. They made phone calls to specialists whose names carried prestige. But Chief was watching, always watching, and he began to notice the subtle shifts. Victoria's visits grew shorter, her excuses more elaborate. She had fundraisers to attend, friends who needed her, responsibilities that apparently superseded a dying husband. Marcus started appearing with documents, contracts that needed signatures, decisions about the company that couldn't wait. Each conversation ended with the same suggestion. Perhaps it was time to step back, to let the next generation take the helm while he focused on his health. James approached differently, his strategy cloaked in brotherly concern. He spoke of protecting the family's assets, of ensuring everything was properly structured before the inevitable. He'd already consulted estate planners, he mentioned casually, and had some ideas about liquidating certain properties to maximize value. Patricia simply began treating her father as though he'd already departed, making decisions about the household, rearranging furniture, updating decor as if preparing a museum dedicated to someone's memory rather than serving someone still breathing. If you're still watching, take a second to like, share, and subscribe. It helps us keep bringing you powerful stories every week. Sarah remained constant. She learned to prepare the soft foods his supposedly failing appetite required. She read to him when he claimed his eyes had grown too tired. She sat in silence when words felt insufficient, just present, just there. Chief found himself torn between gratitude for her devotion and anguish at deceiving the one person whose love apparently needed no inheritance to fuel it. By the third week, the masks began slipping. Marcus didn't wait for permission anymore. He simply informed his father of decisions already made. Key employees, loyal people who'd built the company alongside Chief, received termination notices. Marcus's explanation was efficiency, modernization, cutting dead weight. But Chief knew better. He was installing his own people, creating an infrastructure of loyalty that answered to him rather than to the legacy his father had built. James made his move with breathtaking audacity. He sold one of the family's crown jewels, the Grandview Hotel, a property Chief had purchased during the company's early expansion and had sworn would remain in the family for generations. James justified it as necessary liquidity, as though his father's impending death had already created a cash crisis requiring immediate remedy. What James didn't know was that Thomas, the family attorney, had anticipated exactly this kind of betrayal. He'd arranged for trusted associates to purchase the property, holding it in secret trust until Chief was ready to reclaim what was rightfully his. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday evening. Chief lay in the guest room where Victoria had insisted he be moved, claiming his master suite needed deep cleaning that somehow never quite finished. Through walls that were supposed to be soundproof but weren't, he heard his wife's laughter. It carried notes he hadn't heard in years, bright and unguarded, and aimed at someone who wasn't him. Sarah had gone to the kitchen, and Chief, despite his act, could still move when necessary. He made his way slowly to the window overlooking the courtyard. There, beneath the security lights, he watched his wife of 43 years embrace a man young enough to be her son. Their intimacy was unmistakable. Their comfort with each other spoke of routine, rather than recklessness. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This was a pattern, a parallel life Victoria had constructed while her husband supposedly withered upstairs. The betrayal hollowed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He'd prepared for greed. He'd expected his children might reveal their priorities. But this, the casual discarding of vows and history and shared decades, this cut deeper than any fictional cancer ever could. He returned to bed not as a man pretending to be dying, but as one genuinely wounded. The situation escalated when Marcus and James, in a development that would have been comedic if it weren't so tragic, discovered each had been secretly selling family assets. Marcus had liquidated properties. James had sold the hotel. Both had justified their actions as protective measures, neither admitting they'd simply seen opportunity in their father's supposed decline. Their confrontation turned physical, grown men in expensive suits throwing punches in the marble foyer, while staff scattered and Victoria screamed at them to stop making spectacles of themselves. Sarah found Chief later that night, tears streaming down her face, apologizing for her family, as though their failures were somehow her responsibility. That's when he made his decision. The test had concluded. The results were irrefutable, but the experiment had taken on new dimension. Sarah insisted on taking him away from the mansion, away from the toxicity poisoning what should have been his final days. She wanted to bring him to his ancestral village, to the small community where he'd been born before ambition had pulled him towards cities and skylines. Chief agreed, not because he believed in the village healer Sarah had heard about, but because he needed distance, needed perspective, needed to remember who he'd been before wealth had complicated everything. They left at dawn, Sarah telling no one, understanding somehow that this departure required secrecy. Behind them, the mansion continued its dysfunctional theater, but the primary actor had exited the stage. The village welcomed him like a returning legend. Word spread through dusty paths and under mango trees that Chief had come home. People emerged from modest houses, bringing gifts their poverty made precious. Fresh eggs, home-pressed palm oil, hand-woven cloth. They didn't see a billionaire or a dying man. They saw the boy who'd left decades ago promising to return, promising to remember. And he had remembered. The school bore his name. The health clinic existed because of his funding. Roads had been paved, wells had been dug, lives had been transformed by a man who'd never forgotten where he came from. The healer arrived at sunset, an ancient woman whose eyes carried the kind of knowing that transcended medical textbooks. She examined Chief in the small room where he was staying, Sarah hovering anxiously nearby. The old woman spent more time looking at his eyes than checking his pulse. Finally, she smiled, revealing gaps where teeth had once been, and spoke words that stunned Sarah but didn't surprise Chief. "This man carries no sickness in his body," she announced, "only in his spirit. Someone has wounded him deeply, but it's not a wound that herbs can heal. That's heart sickness, and only truth can cure it." Sarah turned to her father, confusion giving way to understanding giving way to something else. Chief met her gaze, and finally released the truth he'd carried alone for weeks. He explained everything: the stage diagnosis, the test, the attorney's safeguards, the surveillance he'd quietly installed in his room that had captured every conversation, every betrayal, every moment of revealed character. Sarah's reactions cycled through shock and hurt, and finally settled on a fierce protectiveness. She understood then why he'd done it, understood the loneliness of suspecting your life's work had built walls rather than bonds. She held his hand and told him what he needed to hear, that one genuine connection mattered more than a dozen false ones, that he wasn't alone, that love hadn't abandoned him even if he'd found it only in one place instead of 5. They spent 3 days in the village, and Chief felt something shift inside him. The simplicity of genuine affection, unattached to expectation, reminded him why he'd worked so hard in the first place. Not to build monuments to ego, but to create security for people he loved. The fact that most of those people had proven unworthy didn't erase the nobility of the original intention. It just clarified who deserved to benefit from his continued efforts. When Chief announced they were returning to the city, the villagers gathered to see him off. An elder spoke blessings over him, words about wisdom and discernment and the importance of protecting your peace from those who would steal it for profit. Chief listened carefully, storing these truths alongside the lessons his test had taught. He was returning to his mansion, but he was returning changed, clearer, ready to render judgment not from anger, but from understanding. The car pulled through the estate gates at midday, sunshine making the imported marble gleam, like false promises. Chief stepped out not as an invalid, but as a man reclaimed, his posture straight, his step certain. The security guards froze, their radios crackling with confused reports. The man who was supposed to be dying had returned impossibly vital, impossibly alive, impossibly aware. Inside, his family gathered in stages, drawn by shock and disbelief and the sudden, terrible understanding that something had fundamentally shifted. Chief called them together in the study, where months earlier he'd planned this entire orchestration. He called his attorney as well, Thomas, arriving with documents that would reshape everything. What followed wasn't revenge, though it might have looked like it to those receiving his judgment. Marcus lost his claim to the company he'd tried to hijack, his inheritance reduced to the money he'd already squandered. James found himself cut off from further assets, the hotel he'd sold remaining forever beyond his reach through his father's careful maneuvering. Patricia received conditions rather than certainties. Prove your care through action, not words, and perhaps redemption remained possible. Victoria was simply asked to leave, the marriage not legally dissolved but functionally ended, her choices having severed what vows once held together. Only Sarah received what Chief had originally intended for all of them: stewardship of his life's work, leadership of the company, and access to the wealth he'd built. Not because she'd passed a test, but because she'd never realized she was being tested. Her care hadn't been performance. It had been character, revealed through consistency when no reward was guaranteed. The company flourished under her direction in ways it hadn't under Marcus's desperate grasping. She reinstated the fired employees, men and women who'd given decades to building something meaningful. She operated not from ego but from principle, and the business responded by growing stronger, expanding further, becoming the legacy Chief had always envisioned. Months later, Chief sat in the same study where this story began, watching his youngest daughter through glass walls as she led a board meeting with confidence earned rather than inherited. He thought about the question that had started everything. Who would care for him when he was powerless? He'd found his answer, painful though the process had been. One person, one genuine soul. And he discovered that one was enough. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And tell us in the comments what part spoke to you the most. And if you thought this one was powerful, wait till you hear the next story we're working on. The lesson wasn't about wealth or inheritance or even family, really. It was about the difference between what people say and what they do, between performance and presence, between loving someone and loving what someone provides. Chief had built an empire, but his true legacy wasn't measured in properties or profit margins. It was measured in the character of the one child who'd loved him without calculation, who'd stayed without reward, who'd proven that some things, the most important things, still can't be bought. Riches reveal character, but poverty of spirit can exist in even the wealthiest homes. The test we face isn't whether we'll care for others when it's convenient, but whether we'll remain when remaining costs us something. Chief learned what too many discover too late, that everything you build can be transferred except integrity, and everyone you provide for will receive your wealth except those who never earned the privilege through simple, honest love. The mansion still stands, golden in certain light, but it houses different occupants now. Sarah and her father, both older, both wiser, both understanding that home was never about marble or chandeliers. It was about truth, finally spoken, about love, finally recognized, about a test that revealed everything, and a daughter who'd never needed to study for it because she'd already known the only answer that mattered. I'm here, and I'm staying, and that's enough.